Welcome to Rockstock Channel. We are very privileged to have Ben Steinberg here with us today, who is at Venn Strategies, a political lobbyist in Washington, D.C. And he has also put together a coalition, which you're going to talk about a little bit. But a number of our clients, we have a couple of clients in common, Talon Metals in nickel, Piedmont Lithium in lithium, both of whom have successfully received grants from the Department of Energy through the bipartisan infrastructure law. But you have a few other clients, I think, who received loans. Why don't you just tell us a bit about what you do, Ben? And then we waited until after the results kind of came in from the election, except for one result, which we'll talk about. But for the most part, we have a modest Republican majority. You know, the Senate's going to be Democrat. And the red wave, the Republican wave that some had been predicting, which could have been a headwind against a lot of the climate and critical minerals legislation that Biden passed, that headwind is not going to happen, right? We're calling this, Biden's bullish congressional climate, right? Because the momentum that's been put in place over the last few years should likely continue over the next two. And people like Jigar Shah at the Loan Programs Office, who have spent a lot of time, getting ready to deploy, to use Jennifer Granholm. I'm expecting there's going to be a lot of such deployment of loans on top of the grants, that have already, started. So within that context, Ben, just tell us a bit about what you do, and we're going to ask a bunch of questions more focused on policy than politics, but inevitably there'll be some politics thrown in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me, Howard. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Ben Steinberg. I'm an executive vice president at Venn Strategies. My background is I spent 9 years at the U.S. Department of Energy, short stint at the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House, came over to Venn about 4 years ago, and have a heavy focus in the critical minerals and battery development work, building the North American supply chain. Our firm is about 60 people. It's bipartisan. We do consulting across a number of practice areas. We have a large infrastructure practice. About 10 staff work on batteries and critical minerals in our infrastructure practice that I co-chair. Really, I want to say, it's interesting you talk about Biden. The push on critical minerals really started during the Trump administration, where he signed a few executive orders. And at the beginning of the Biden administration, he signs the executive order on America's supply chains. And he's focused on 4 supply chains, one of which is critical minerals, and the second one is on batteries. The other 2 are chips and healthcare supply chains, but from the beginning, they have been laser focused on this. We saw this coming in 2020, and when he got elected, we formed the Battery Materials and Technology Coalition, which started as 6 members, and now it's up to 16. It was formed with the purpose of supporting the development of a North American supply chain. Most of the members are in US and in Canada, some of which also have international plays outside of North America. We represent from mining through battery pack development, as well as recycling. So to give you a flavor of it, there are 2 lithium companies, a nickel company, 4 graphite companies, 3 silicon companies, a manganese company, some battery technology firms, a cell and pack maker, and 2 recyclers. So that, and the reason these guys wanted to form is, hey, if we join together, there's really an opportunity to work with the government and grow the industry together. And all eyes were on the infrastructure bill at the time. So I'm happy to get into how that all unfolded and developed, but really this has been the group that has created the opportunity at Department of Energy, the $6 billion, and we saw half of it deployed last month, a very exciting moment in October.
And we're going to go through that because I put together a spreadsheet here of all of those grants. It was $2.8 billion. And I grouped them here by graphite anode, non-graphite anode, cathode, lithium, nickel, and then recycling other. There's only one project in nickel in America, Talon, which was 115 million grant. I also highlighted here the use of funds. Some of these are for commercial plants, others are for demonstration plants. And so Piedmont received a loan for a hydroxide processing plant.
Grant, not a loan.
It's a grant.
It's a grant.
I keep mixing up. This is free money.
Yeah.
This is free money. Albemarle received a grant, for spodumene processing, not mining. There's a distinction. They refused to so far, fund mining, but anything that's not digging the hole in the ground, but processing into spodumene concentrate, that's what Albemarle got, even without a permit. I'm curious about those grants. Is that money like in the coffers of the companies already, or are there hurdles before they get that money? Like, could Piedmont use that money, for, I don't know, early, long time lead items and the like? Because Albemarle, they're talking about like not until 2027. They don't need this money. So like, how does that work with the deployment, actual deployment?
Yeah, I'll back up and explain how this all came to be. We put together the legislation, the BMTC, and we worked both in the House and Senate to introduce it at a $10 billion mark. And we split the funding up between processing and then the battery component manufacturing and recycling. And we split the funding in two areas of the department. And we did that to build the political support around it, right? So you got Western Democrats who are pro mining and processing. You have some Southeast Democrats, some Midwest Democrats and Republicans. And we really stitched together the coalition that would support this. When it eventually got its way into the infrastructure bill, it got whittled down to $6 billion. The reason we didn't do mining, and we wanted to, we have mining clients and mining members of the BMTC, is because the support wasn't there at that moment in the Democratic Party. Today, I might think differently, but 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, it wasn't there. I
want to dig into that like in greater detail. So the political calculus that in America, mining is bad, right? So you couldn't lobby to get mining in there, but now you're feeling that the Democrats may have moved.
Yeah, I think we've lost social license here, right? I mean, North Carolina used to be the center of mining from the 50s to the 80s. It was the cradle of lithium in the tin spodumene belt, and then it left. We have a lot to do to build that social license, to engage communities, to listen to folks. The Democratic Party, the left-wing part of the party, has been successful with keep it in the ground movement, and no matter what, right? And in that time, mining has evolved. It's much more sophisticated. It's less environmentally intrusive. But still, if you're in a community and there's a hole in the ground next to you, I think there's going to be some consternation and concern, and there's going to be a lot of issues that need to be discussed and worked out between government, between the community. So we have work to do. And I think the administration has been fairly bullish on this, saying, look, we understand, but we need this stuff to electrify the economy and bring down our emissions. This is a pathway that we need to take. So I do think that things are shifting slowly but surely.
Do you think like there could be funding for mining, right? Out of the grants, out of the loans, out of...
Yeah, so I think we're headed in that direction. Certainly the passage, the president's signature on battery minerals for the Defense Production Act, Title III program, supporting specific mineral development is a sign in that direction from the administration, from the public, saying this is important for national security. It's important for economic security in our country. And then when we put together, the Congress put together a Ukraine supplemental funding bill to help the Ukrainians in their war efforts, they put in specific money for critical minerals development that is critical, that goes towards mining. So DoD right now is receiving proposals from mining entities in the United States, which also includes Australia and Canada, by the way, and those will go towards mining efforts. So we are shifting in that direction. The other thing that's happening is the Department of Interior is working on sustainable mining reform at a policy and regulatory level, and they will be coming out with their report after many stakeholder meetings and engagements with the community on what their recommendations are for doing this in a sustainable fashion. And that'll feed into the permitting reform too. The third thing that's happening is the White House runs a permitting reform council, and mineral developments are part of that. It'll be codified if the permitting legislation goes through in Congress, and there will be a lot more focus on not only the mining but the processing projects. So a lot of activity. I do think we're shifting there. There is a lot more that needs to be done with federal, state, federal, local coordination, educating the public about this. You know, we have power lines everywhere. We have power plants. We have oil rigs. We have wind turbines. This is going to be part of how we work, how we live in the future.
You mentioned a bunch of things in there, which are really great. And for the viewers here, we did a video a few months ago with John Miller of Cowen, which covered a lot of Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law. So there's a whole of government approach here. You know, the Department of Energy, you know, has money that they're deploying. And but you mentioned the DoD, the DPA, the Defense Production Act, that's coming from the Department of Defense. We have clients in Canada and Australia, and they're like, oh, can we tap into this Department of Energy, you know, loans, grants? And the answer to that is largely no from the grants and the loan side. But the Department of Defense, from a national security point of view, has a separate pocket of money, and that money has been growing to a degree. Ben, you told me yesterday that those monies, you know, people thought was a small 5-10 million. You know, you said it could go up to 50 million, but it was mainly for like studies, engineering, not so much full project development. You were suggesting that could, well, with what you're talking about here now, the Department of Interior hasn't really opined at all, but they're working on something, and that's important. The Department of Interior is where the Bureau of Land Management, everything that's out west, and you're mentioning in the White House has a permitting reform council. I mean, it definitely seems to be other elements of the, you're right, this started under Trump. This has been a multi-year, you know, bipartisan effort, and it seems like there's very good momentum there. I saw you mentioned the DFC. What's that stand for?
Development Finance Corporation.
Development Finance Corporation used to be called the Overseas Private Investment Corp. So now this was kind of this was under Trump. They were saying get rid of OPIC, but instead it was a response to China's Belt and Road. What could be, you know, some funding alternative for emerging markets, right? So there was an equity check written from this DFC to TechMet in Brazil for a cobalt nickel project. So I'm interested to see like something like that could fund, you know, for example, Piedmont in Ghana, right? Theoretically, like this is emerging market funding. This money won't go, this is meant to be development finance corporation. It's not meant to go to rich countries, right? But to the extent that there are African or other emerging or frontier, it could be money there could go to Argentine projects theoretically. Yeah. Is there some movement on that score? Because I see like Jigar Shah and Jennifer Granholm, it's all deploy out of Department of Energy. But like, I think that could be a big pocket of money if it were deployed to minerals, and they don't have this no mining, right? Like this is going to mining.
Yeah, Howard, I think you're pointing out a really important whole of government approach that's really taking place. It's not just on the domestic side, it's also on the international side. And that goes towards diplomacy, deploying loans and aid. It's going to private sector engagement abroad, and it's going to trade issues. So I'm happy to kind of walk through what it is that the government's doing. It's really a mix of these loan agencies like Development Finance Corporation and the Export-Import Bank, partnered with state, Department of State and Department of Commerce. And of course, you have the U.S. Trade Representative who's thinking through our trade relationships with individual companies multilaterally and particularly with China on tariffs. So one way that I'll talk about it is a new initiative that the State Department announced a number of months ago called the Mineral Security Partnership. And that's partnerships with most of the industrialized world to access mineral deposits, put some sustainability and ESG category criteria around those projects, and try to bring public and private sector investment to those. I mean, one of the stories that folks are familiar with that listen to your podcast is that the Chinese have gone in and provided very low, they've captured investment and projects abroad, paying a lot of money, probably overpaying. And so this is an effort by the rest of the world to come into those countries and say, you have an alternative and we're here to help. So they are fast working in two tracks. One is to build those sustainability criteria, and then two, come together on a project list between Japan, Korea, Germany, Canada, Australia, US, and try to figure out who's going to finance what and who gets the resource back in their countries. So all of that is happening live, and it's very complicated because they got to negotiate between the different countries. Really very encouraging development that there's global coordination and that the US will get a substantial part of these resources as they get financed and developed, right? Like the USTR has these tariffs that started during the Trump era, the 301 trade tariffs. And so in the next Congress, the question, and with this administration in a divided Congress, are they going to reevaluate, reimagine the 301 tariffs and reduce some of those barriers for imports, keep them the way they are? It's unclear right now.
Let's talk about the carrots before the sticks, but the USTR, I mean, those are the Trump aluminum and steel tariffs that were deployed, but Biden has not, kind of removed them. And that's why, steel companies are having such a good time in the United States, minting, profits they've not, minted before. There could be some tariffs that are put on batteries or, maybe lithium, like could lithium coming from China, from Albemarle, be subject to higher tariffs at some point to motivate more domestic or non-Chinese
there are, right? So like, and it's weird because you can get a full battery which is tariffed at a less amount than the actual raw material, so it disincentivizes us to import and do the production here versus just shipping in the final product. So I think there's incongruence that they know about that they are trying to work through. In the meantime, there are a lot of exemptions that are put forward. Graphite is one of them, where those tariffs are exempted because of the national importance and are because we haven't fully stood up.
Because it's 100% coming from China. So
right.
Look, we got to be careful because there's like tit for tat with China. Okay, like you do one thing here and then they do something elsewhere, and there's a lot of American interest. GM has a big Chinese business, Tesla has a big Chinese business, so it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I'm more interested in what you're talking about, this mineral securities partnership via the State Department, because there's been a lot of statements coming out of Europe lately. There have been like a lot of statements about strategic, labeling certain projects strategic, and then like having to fund them, but it's not clear to me that the European Commission says, this is what we propose, where does how does it then get implemented and into funding? You're saying that this mineral securities partnership seems to be, Americans are talking to the European Commission as well as Australia, as well as Canada, and they're looking kind of globally, at projects, specific projects of
Correct.
continental or national or ex-China strategic importance. And then that one we need to build, right? That one we need to support. We need to fund that one or these 10, right? But then if that project's in Europe, like we represent European Metals Holdings, and there's a lot of talk about this Czech project, Sinovac, which is a past producing tin and tungsten mine, but has a ton of lithium. It's like a big advanced project in lithium, about that being labeled strategic. Okay. But I just thought that this would be Europe for Europe. I just presumed that there would be some deal that would connect it to Germany. What you're saying is that the State Department might be talking about this, it could be interconnected with some Americans or Japanese and Koreans, but semeingly, ex-China, right?
Correct. And there's a tension there, right? Because we're trying to work with them on finding those good projects and financing them and bringing the minerals into Europe, into the US, into Canada, into Australia to process, so they don't all go back to China to process and then make the batteries there. And then you had the Inflation Reduction Act that passed, which excludes non-FTA countries, which is the majority of Europe. So I think they're saying, wait, we're trying to work together. What's going on? So there is that balance. And bottom line, we are competing. If they want to build their auto industry, they have a very strong auto industry in Europe. They need all the minerals and materials they can get too. So we are collaborating and competing at the same time. So that's good theater. It's interesting how that will all shake out in the coming years.
But there's definitely movement and paranoia and general there's bipartisanship within America, but there's also between America and Europe in understanding that we want an energy transition. It's another industrial revolution, and China has very quietly and quickly had the foresight to lock up the whole supply chain. And the anti-mining, the outsourcing everything to China mentality, has to change, right? We've seen our vulnerability through COVID of being reliant on China, being reliant on Russia. So there has to be, an era of sustained, or localized, supply. But it's an industry that, on the other hand is hated, right? And it's not a very sophisticated, private sector, infrastructure of finance for a lot of these types of companies. So it needs government support. It needs the loans, it needs the tax credits, and it also needs the political okay, just the bully pulpit of saying, we need this, mining's okay, and pushback to the NIMBYism. It used to be back in the 50s, people live, we had to make room for the vehicles. So I'm living here in New York, and they just they broke up, town. They said we got to build a highway, eminent domain, right? I haven't seen eminent domain implemented yet for mining, and hopefully it doesn't get to that point where that's needed. But the small vocal minority, combined with very, media that thrives on conflict, right? It's very easy to conflate, a small NIMBY resistance into, a political nightmare, right? That, so
And I would argue you need not only mining, you need the processing and you need the battery component work here.
You need the whole supply chain.
You have a nickel mine right now, the Eagle mine, which doesn't have the processing capabilities in the United States. So that, I think they would prefer to keep it in the US, but that has to go to Canada, it has to go to Europe. It probably ends up in the Chinese supply chain. And so we're trying to correct that by building each of the steps in the process so we have a captive supply chain here that can support our energy independence.
Well, that's why Talon, they won that grant for a processing plant in North Dakota.
Yep.
Right? But the processing plant wasn't in Minnesota, right? The mine's in Minnesota. They still need to mine, right?
Yep.
They need to get that mine approved. But yes, it makes no sense to just ship it all around the world. Everything needs to be localized, and we have the capacity. We have a lot of resources here in the United States to do it. But going back to, again, we have a number of clients outside of the United States that want to tap into money here. So there's the DPA, which we mentioned, a company like, I know Manchin visited Alberta, last year or earlier this year. And we represent E3 metals, E3 lithium, direct lithium extraction, energy transition from, a former oil field. It's partnered with Exxon, a subsidiary of Exxon in Imperial. This isn't a client of yours. I'm just bringing it up in theoretically, they can tap into DPA funding, right? Up to maybe $50 million, maybe through this mineral security partnership. There's all this talk about the Salton Sea, which interestingly didn't get any grants from this first path. I mean, Lilac got something, but GM had an investor day yesterday, and they were talking about their equity stake in Control Thermal. GM's a pretty astute political actor. I was just surprised not to see. Anyway, that was just the first round of grants.
On this round of grants, companies are in negotiation with DOE. They were selected. The money isn't handed over on day one. They have to negotiate terms of a contract, sign it, and those negotiations will go through Q1 and Q2 of this year. In 2023. I think they'd like to see all the negotiations done by March, April of next year. And it's at that point that the money starts to flow from the government side. And to your point, like, these are multi-year projects. These are 3 to 5 year projects. And so it's going to take some time. It's not like we're going to see, processed lithium come out of a plant on day one. It's going to take a year or two for that to happen at least. So in terms of the second tranche of grants, we anticipated it'll be sometime in 2023, probably midway through the year. We saw the grants come out in July of June of last year. And I think it's going to be similar timeline. They really want to get this money out. Time is of the essence to move these projects along because they do take multiple years to develop.
Okay, so grants in the middle of the year, but Department of Energy loans, those could start happening anytime. We may see one.
I anticipate a lot of. You probably have 60 projects in the pipeline right now in the minerals and processing space. So you can imagine a number of those going through and up through the cell and pack development. I really think it's a huge focus of the loan programs and what they're doing. As you said, Jigar is all over it. His staff has been incredible trying to move these projects along through due diligence and contract. So it's a really exciting time. There's going to be more coming soon.
Great.
The interesting thing also is a lot of these projects are in purple and red states. That's where the projects have been. That's where the ecosystems, the regional ecosystems for the auto industry and the battery industry are located. So you talked about Piedmont Lithium in Tennessee. It's a red state. You talk about Talon Metals in North Dakota, it's a red state. So to bolster your point about finger pointing, it would be potentially Republicans finger pointing at their own states.
That's a fair,
So,
that's a very good analysis. I'm wondering, do you think like the Democrats and the administration, there was a political calculus in giving money to those to help win over? Because I would have thought they would have supported like pork into, blue states.
if they didn't have that as political calculus, it was a good political move.
Well, they did fund right-wing candidates, like extreme candidates, so that they would lose in the election. So it could have been a cynical ploy.
I think there's a thought there. I absolutely do. Why wouldn't we try to have political, regional diversity, economic development in most states, and try to center our manufacturing and group it around where the automakers are. I mean, which is in the Southeast, it's in the Midwest, and it's in Texas, and a little bit in the Sun Belt going out to California. So I mean, there's a lot of reasons why they were deployed where they were deployed.
Okay. Do you know anything like Canada has, there's been talk in Canada, they put out a white paper. They seem to be following the United States. They said by the end of the year, they're going to pass some sort of legislation. Are you knowledgeable about that? Have any insights? Because there's an element,
I mean,
leveling the playing field. Like there's been some, like Tesla, for example, was talking about possibly building a plant in Canada, and then through the IRA, 48C and 45X, now the playing field looks maybe unlevel, and he may come to the United States. So, and that's true. Like Nouveau Monde, for example, there were 5 or 6 graphite plays funded in America. Nouveau Monde is a great advanced project in Canada, couldn't tap into that money. So is there a Canadian answer, to that?
I would say that Quebec was first before the US. I mean, Quebec's, 5+ years into developing their battery supply chain work. They have the Bécancour battery park. They're developing a second one because they've run out of space. There's a tremendous amount of activity on the mining and mineral processing and cathode and anode development side. It's situated next to Ontario, who has a lot of the car manufacturing and battery component and battery work as well. So those 2 provinces I see as leading, but you mentioned Alberta and some of the northern provinces, British Columbia, who also have minerals out there and have a burgeoning market out of, Vancouver and Calgary. So you really see the provinces leading in Canada, and they are putting their money where their mouth is. They're providing loans and grants to companies. They're doing a lot of cost sharing. So a tremendous amount of activity. The Canadian government at the federal level is also involved at a strategic level. They are deploying cash, but to your point, they probably will be deploying more. And so that partnership is number one for the United States. It's, the foundation of our coalition is, both countries working together and utilizing our strengths. And I think it's working. I mean, most of the companies have operations or headquarters in one or the other countries because of that connectivity and synergy.
So China and the US, Biden just met Xi, I think, at the COP27. I haven't read anything about that other than the general tone seemed from headlines that it was a bit of a ratcheting down of rhetoric compared to 2 years worth of everything's just been anti-China. So do you have any read on that? And I've thought that even though the raw materials are processed in China and we're reliant and we have to fix that supply chain, China's leadership on this issue from a climate point of view, right? Like we should be welcoming a CATL, like in the expertise that China has. If you're just focused on climate independent of the national security implications, because like Goshen, a Chinese company, is, seems to be cutting a deal in Michigan, which was extremely quiet. I don't know if that deal's yet gone through. Ford wants to have a deal with CATL, but that got uncertain during Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. So do you have any sense of what's happening there, kind of geopolitically? Could the battery, raw material, EV, everything about the supply chain be somewhat of an olive branch, right? To ratchet down overall geopolitical tensions, and that translate into, maybe more of a warming of, or allowing of, Chinese investment in partnerships with American companies like Ford wants to do, and they want to compete with, the Koreans and Japanese, for battery plants. So any thought on that topic?
I think I have an opinion, and I also have a perspective on your question. I think markets are regionalizing. And so where you have major auto manufacturing in the US and Europe and in China, both from, light duty vehicle all the way to heavy duty vehicle, we should have supply chains around that. And it's incredible what China has done. They really built the industry, and they centered it around mineral processing. And because they had the value add processing there, they were able to build the technology there as well, and ship minerals in from all over the world. So it's really incredible what they've done. The other thing is the US will never be a China, nor should it try to be. Part of my background is in cybersecurity, national security work, and the nexus between energy and national security. And I've seen too many things to believe that bringing in a CATL to build here and help us grow, to believe that that's a good thing for the country. That's my personal opinion. I don't speak for any of my clients or companies. I think there is China and their government largely have state-owned enterprises. They do not play by the same rules, and they've done a lot of anti-competitive work when companies come in and work in their country, and when they're abroad, they pay for things that are way over the price of what they're actually worth, so it diminishes the value, so that they can have access to the resource. So there's a lot of things we have to be careful of, and not forget the national security implications, even with their economic prowess and technical prowess. So I think the Goshen deal in Michigan, I don't think it's through. I think the government, the US government, if it does look like it's going through, is probably going to evaluate it through the Committee on Foreign Investment in the US as to whether that's sort of a Trojan horse for the Chinese government to enter into the US. So another way of saying it is China should keep doing what they're doing for the world, but the US really does need to, for a lot of reasons, build out the supply chain here to support our auto industry. I don't think it's healthy that, one country own 80% of up to 100% of a market. That's not good for the world.
Okay, fair enough. On the other hand, there's not any other really manufacturers of scale that are producing like LFP batteries, right? And Ford wants to use LFP, and Tesla, and so this technology, that CATL dominates, and some other Chinese groups. Ford wanted to have a partnership, I think in Mexico. They said in Mexico or in North America, I forget exactly, but I wasn't sure if it was Canada, the US, or Mexico, but they wanted to have a battery partnership with CATL, and will that be allowed? And then will that, be, if it's not in America, will it then be, not get the benefits of the IRAs?
Yeah.
local content.
We have history to tell us how this has gone. We had the Recovery Act in 2009. We opened the door to relationships with China across R&D. A lot of our workers in the auto and battery industry went over to China to help form CATL and other companies. We had that warmness. The Department of Energy staff was going to China every month, right? And we were sharing. And in that time, they built the industry and we didn't. And so I don't want us to lose sight of the short-term versus the long-term vision, because China's vision is long-term. They think in 5 to 25 to 100-year terms, and we're thinking in election cycles. I really do think we need to stick to, hey guys, manufacturing at home is good. It's jobs, it's opportunity, it's security, and it's climate change mitigation, right? So we do have to balance that short-term need, and so that's the tricky part. But
look, if
5 to 10 years.
If CATL or Goshen, and Goshen I think is more private sector, I don't think it's state funded. If they're creating American jobs, and they're selling into the American market, it's just, what's wrong with that?
Yeah,
it's like after all years of China stealing, our IP, we can learn from their IP.
Yeah. I mean, this is a challenge, right? We've seen before where we've let in the Chinese. You see it in like the rail industry where they won transit contracts, and they set up the CRRC set up a factory in Massachusetts. And what we learned from the factory in Massachusetts is for every one job in Massachusetts, you had 5 jobs in China cranking out the actual work and then having things shrink wrapped and sent to the factory to bolt together. So I really do think we need to be very, very careful and very intense focus about what it is that we would be allowing, if anything, from their country.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
And really, now final question, because I just thought of another one. So SQM, okay, the biggest producer of lithium in the world.
Sure.
Chilean, okay, free trade agreement country, is 26% owned and has 3 board seats by a Chinese state-backed lithium company called Tangxi. They sell most of their lithium in the last few years going to China.
Right.
But they have, a joint venture in Australia where they're going to mine and process in Australia. It's not going to go to China. So they're going to have lithium hydroxide available from Australia that could be exported all over the world. They're going to have carbonate and hydroxide in Chile that could be exported all over the world. Will SQM's Chilean and Australian product, if sold into the United States, be considered under the IRA rules, right? Or
you mean for the clean
subsidies,
vehicle
EV subsidies?
Yeah, for the clean vehicle tax credit.
Yes.
I don't know. I mean, that's why we're waiting for the guidance. I would think yes, but I think they have to classify what a foreign entity of concern is and what percent ownership and decision-making power a foreign entity of concern has in entities that are not foreign entities of concern. So I think that's the debate going on right now at Treasury and in the White House, and probably working with the Intel community and Defense Department and Energy to figure out at what point do you separate those that are allowed as part of the credit and those that are not. SQM is the perfect example. I'm sure that those 3 letters have been spoken out loud many, many times in the last few months in the government.
Yeah, look, the same applies. Tangxi is a 51% owner, I think, or it's 50-50, with Albemarle in Greenbushes in Australia. So one could argue who controls that. I guess the government will have to look case by case, and then the companies are going to lobby and say, well, we need this exception. But it's very interesting. Like in Canada, they just announced, certain state-owned Chinese need to divest from like 3 very small lithium companies. It was the Canadian government who forced Nutrien to sell their stake in SQM, and they didn't care who it was sold to 4 years ago. Now
Right.
they care. I wonder if the U.S. government, SQM trades on the New York Stock Exchange, right? Could there be some forced divestiture required? Would the U.S. government tell the Chinese government or SQM that they got to get rid of, like, I don't know, Tang should make a ton of money on it. I'd be all for that, right? They would nearly double the money that they made on the investment, and then they could deploy that capital, into the industry elsewhere. But anyway, it's a very interesting political question.
Well, that brings back to the mineral security partnership. Are they just going after new deposits, or are they going after existing deposits where the Chinese have majority stake and trying to push them out? That question I don't know the answer to, but I mean, it kind of gets to what you're saying as to, is there diplomacy from other countries, US and others, to push the Chilean government to change the terms of the deals they have with the Chinese investors? It's a fascinating.
Like, there's a number of countries that are like in China's camp, a number of countries that are in the US camp, and then there are a number of countries that are kind of in play, right? And I think, like, over the last number of years, Xi and the Belt and Road is kind of like looked at South America, like and seen Argentina and Chile in play, right? And SQM today, I just read yesterday, is the biggest taxpayer into the government's coffers as a result of the lithium prices, rising. So it's an important, actor, and it's an important lever that the U.S. could, prospectively have. But, SQM selling most of their lithium to China, they're selling most of their copper to China, right? It'll be a difficult thing for Chile to, to cut off China, right? So anyway, to be continued. Really enjoyed the conversation. We covered a lot of ground, and
thank you so much for having me on. Really appreciated the conversation.